The wind howled through the mountains that night, but it wasn't the blizzard that stole Nora's breath. It was the bobcat, injured, silent, and staring into her soul like he'd always belonged by her fire. A wild animal. A decision that defied logic. And a bond no one could have predicted. But what he did on his final night. It shattered every wall she'd ever built. Stay with us. This story will change the way you see the wild, and maybe yourself. When the wild comes knocking. The wind had been screaming through Crescent Butte for hours, one of those early January storms that turned the mountains white and the air sharp as glass. At 8,000 feet, life slowed to a crawl when the snow came, and Nora Bellamy was used to it. She had her routines: stack the firewood high, boil extra stew, and keep the radio tuned low for weather alerts. She didn't expect visitors. No one came this high in winter unless they were lost or desperate. It was just past 9 p.m. when the sound came, not a knock, but a crash. Wood. A thud. Then silence. Nora flinched, her spoon halfway to her lips. The power had blinked out 30 minutes ago, and her cabin was lit only by the amber flicker of the hearth. She waited, breath held, trying to convince herself it was just a branch from the pines cracking under snow. Then another sound. A low, rasping grunt, like something exhaling its last breath. She moved to the door, grabbing the heavy flashlight from the hook by the stove. Her boots were already by the threshold, always ready. Heart thudding, she unlatched the lock and cracked the door open. There, crumpled against the porch steps, was a bobcat. Nora froze. He was bigger than she'd expected, maybe 40 pounds, with thick storm-drenched fur mottled gray and black, his stubby tail twitching weakly. One hind leg was twisted unnaturally beneath him. Blood smeared the snow like an accusation. His eyes were what stopped her from closing the door. Amber. Wild. But not aggressive. Just tired. Watching her. Not pleading. Not threatening. Just watching. She opened the door wider. "God Almighty," she muttered, kneeling beside him. Her flashlight beam caught the puncture wound along his side, crusted with dried blood and bristling with pine needles. He didn't flinch when she touched him, didn't growl or bare his teeth. That scared her more than if he had. Nora was no stranger to wildlife. She'd sketched lynx in Alberta, tracked foxes in Yellowstone. Her hands had drawn the contours of every claw and muscle. But this wasn't a study. This was a choice. Let the wild stay outside, or make space for it inside. She slid her arms beneath the bobcat's trembling body and lifted. It was like cradling a furnace wrapped in bones. He didn't resist. Inside, she laid him gently beside the fireplace, onto a pile of old wool blankets she kept for her housecat Milo. The bobcat's breath came shallow and quick. Steam rose from his fur. His eyes never left her. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, mostly to herself. But the fire cracked. The wind howled. And still, he didn't move. She fetched a bowl of warm water and set it near his head. He didn't drink. She laid her old flannel jacket across his back, more for comfort than warmth. Then she sat, a few feet away, and stared. Her cabin had felt hollow for years. Tonight, it was full of something she didn't have words for yet. By midnight, Milo crept into the room and froze at the sight of the bobcat. The two stared at each other. Nora held her breath. But nothing happened. Milo hissed once, then slunk under the couch. The bobcat blinked once, slowly, then lowered his head onto his paws. Nora exhaled. "Guess you're staying." Outside, the storm raged. But inside, the fire burned, and something wild slept beside it. Nora didn't sleep that night. She sat curled in the rocking chair, watching the bobcat breathe, shallow, uneven but steady. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows against the cabin walls, and outside the storm still pounded the mountains. Inside, the world had narrowed to one injured creature and the woman too stubborn, or too broken, to turn him away. The cabin had once been full of life. Nora's husband, Tom, had built it with his own hands in the late 90s. Their daughter Lily used to play on the rug, dragging crayons across paper while snow piled high against the windows. They'd laughed here. Loved here. Grieved here. Then came the accident. One icy road. One flipped Subaru. One phone call that made everything after it irrelevant. That was 5 winters ago. Since then, Nora had lived quietly. She stopped submitting illustrations to the wildlife journals. Her sketchbooks stayed mostly blank. Her contact with the world reduced to brief check-ins with Paul Renner, her closest neighbor, a retired game warden who dropped off supplies once a month and asked no questions. She'd learned to live like the animals she used to study, solitary, instinctive, surviving by habit. But the presence of the bobcat, this beautiful battered fragment of wilderness, stirred something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear. Not even duty. Something else. She studied him in the firelight. His fur was thicker than most cats she'd drawn, dense for deep snow. His ears were tufted, twitching occasionally as if in dreams. The dark markings across his back looked like ink trails, accidental and perfect. He had the kind of face artists dream of capturing, dignified, angular, scarred. She should have been sketching. Instead, she just watched. By dawn, the storm began to fade. Pale light bled through the frost-laced windows. The bobcat stirred, stretched weakly, and tried to rise. Pain flickered through his body. He dropped back down, head resting near the fire. "You're not going anywhere today," she said softly. And for the first time in half a decade, Nora smiled at someone else in the room. Whispers through the winter. The days that followed unfolded like something between a dream and a quiet rebellion. Nora didn't tell Paul about the bobcat. She knew what he'd say. Wild animals don't belong inside. Especially not apex predators with fangs and instincts built for blood. But the bobcat, no gray patch, hadn't made a single threatening move. She didn't name him aloud, not yet, but the word echoed in her thoughts every time she looked at the dark patch of fur that curved over his spine like smoke. It fit. Gray Patch stayed near the fireplace, only moving to drink water or curl in a new position. His wound, cleaned and dressed with iodine and gauze from Nora's old first aid kit, began to crust at the edges. She knew it needed better treatment, but the nearest vet was 2 hours away down a road that had barely been plowed. Besides, taking him there meant giving him up. That wasn't happening. Milo had stopped hiding on the second day. He watched the bobcat from the arm of the couch, occasionally issuing a warning hiss if Gray Patch twitched too close. But he didn't bolt. Eventually, he even shared the warmth of the fireplace, curling at the opposite end of the rug like a tense houseguest refusing to give up his seat. It was an unspoken truce. Nora hadn't expected the silence to feel so full. The cabin, once echoing with nothing but the creak of wood and the wind outside, now pulsed with the rhythms of presence, the scratch of claws on pine floorboards, the soft snort of Gray Patch's breathing, the way his amber eyes followed her with lazy half-interest. She found herself talking aloud again, not in long conversations but in the little mutterings of daily life. "Don't burn the stew, Bellamy," she'd say to herself as she stirred the pot. "That corner's drafty, you won't like it," she added once when Gray Patch wandered briefly toward the back hallway. Sometimes he listened. Sometimes he didn't. He was, after all, still a bobcat. She began sketching again. It started small, just quick outlines on the back of grocery lists or paper scraps. But by the end of the week, she had pulled her old leather-bound sketch pad from the shelf. The first drawing she completed was a loose, raw piece, Gray Patch curled in front of the fireplace, Milo in the background watching with narrowed eyes. Her pencil strokes were hesitant at first, like a voice relearning how to speak. But the longer she drew, the faster her hands remembered. There was something unfiltered about Gray Patch. Unlike her past subjects, he didn't pose or posture. He existed, purely and unapologetically, and there was nothing Nora loved more than truth in motion. Every twitch of his ear, every slow stretch of his limbs, felt like a gift. A muse that didn't demand anything except space. And then came the morning he approached her. It had been over a week since he arrived. She was pouring tea at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the frosted windows in pale sheets. The air was warm from the wood stove. Milo was perched on the windowsill. Gray Patch rose slowly from the hearth, limped across the room, and stopped at the edge of the rug near her boots. He stood there a moment, his head slightly tilted. Then, with a grace that was still clumsy from healing, he stepped closer. One paw. Then another. Then a third. Nora didn't move. He came to a halt beside her chair and sat, lowering his weight carefully onto his side. Not curled. Not defensive. Just there. Her breath caught. Without thinking, She reached her hand forward, slowly, deliberately, fingers outstretched just beyond reach. He blinked, looked at her hand, and didn't move away. She didn't touch him that time. She didn't need to. The fact that he allowed it, chose to be near her, was enough. Trust, she realized, was a slower thaw than even a Colorado winter. That night, she wrote a single line in her old journal, the one she hadn't touched since Lily's passing. There's something alive in this house again, and it isn't just the fire. Still, she knew this was fragile. She was careful not to assume anything about Gray Patch. He was healing, not tame. When a tree branch cracked too loudly outside, he still flinched. His muscles would stiffen, tail twitching. More than once she watched him wake from sleep with a growl, eyes wide with a memory of wherever he'd come from. There were old stories in his bones. Scars on his muzzle told of fights he didn't win easily. The torn skin above his shoulder, likely from a trap, told of pain he didn't forget. But he stayed. And with every sunrise, Nora felt something inside her shift. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic burst, but like a frozen stream loosening beneath the ice. Little by little. Each day she talked more, drew more, cooked more. Not for guests. Not for herself. For the warmth of company. Even Milo changed. He began grooming himself more. Venturing closer to Gray Patch, no longer shrinking back when the Bobcat stretched nearby. They weren't friends, not exactly, but they weren't enemies either. By the end of the second week, Nora caught them both sleeping in front of the fireplace, not touching, but close enough that their tails nearly did. She didn't disturb them. She simply sat in her rocker, wrapped in a quilt, and watched the fire. Outside, winter still ruled the valley. Inside, something wild had found peace, and something broken had begun to mend. It was the third week when the outside world began to intrude. Nora had kept her secret well. Gray Patch remained inside most days, venturing only briefly onto the back porch before retreating to the warmth of the fire. His limp had improved, and the wound along his side had scabbed over with healthy tissue forming beneath. She thought maybe, just maybe, he'd stay until spring. But it was foolish to think silence could last. It began with a visit from Paul Renner. It was a Wednesday, just afternoon, and Nora was chopping kindling behind the shed. She heard the crunch of tires before she saw his old Ford truck roll up the driveway, snow packed along its undercarriage. Milo darted under the porch. Nora's heart dropped. Inside the cabin, Gray Patch was asleep near the fire. Paul waved as he stepped out, bundled in his wool jacket and scarf. "Got that salt you asked for," he called. "And some fresh milk. I passed through Black Creek on the way up." Nora wiped her gloves on her jeans. "Thanks, Paul." He handed her the grocery bag and gave her a curious glance. "You okay? You look different." "Different how?" "I dunno." He squinted toward the cabin windows. "Just, not as hollow." Nora forced a smile and tried to steady her voice. "Been sleeping better." Paul nodded slowly, as if he didn't fully believe her. "You haven't been out much lately. You missed the fire ban meeting last week." "Didn't know there was one." "Brush conditions are bad. Dry wind coming from the west. Rangers are nervous. They're expecting something big if we don't get another snow." She nodded. "I've been keeping an ear on the Weather Channel." Paul looked past her, toward the cabin's frosted windows. "You've got animal prints all over your porch." Nora stiffened. "Milo likes to wander." "Those are big tracks, Nora." She didn't answer. Paul narrowed his eyes. "You sure you haven't had anything unusual hanging around?" Her silence gave her away. He stepped closer. "Nora, what are you hiding?" "I'm not hiding," she said, quieter than she meant to. "Then tell me what left claw marks that wide on your deck railing." She hesitated. "He came during the storm. Hurt. Bleeding. I didn't call anyone because I thought he'd die that night. But he didn't. He stayed." Paul's face paled. "It's a bobcat?" She nodded. "Inside your house?" "Yes." He stared at her like she'd said she was harboring a fugitive. "That's not safe. You know that, don't you?" "He's not aggressive. He doesn't even growl." I've treated worse feral dogs at the clinic. Nora, that's a wild animal. You think it's docile because it's quiet? It's watching. Always watching. The second he's healthy enough. He hasn't left. That doesn't mean he won't. She looked down at her boots. I know what I'm doing. I'm not sure you do, he said, voice suddenly harder. And if animal control hears about this, you won't have a choice. They'll come up here with tranquilizers and body armor. You won't even get to say goodbye. Then don't tell them, she said, eyes sharp now. Paul looked at her for a long moment. Then his shoulders dropped. I'm not the only one who's noticed, Nora. There've been complaints. Someone saw tracks near Jasper Ridge. Scared their dog half to death. Another hiker spotted a bobcat crossing the trail with what looked like a bandage on its side. Nora's heart clenched. I can keep quiet, he added. But if there's a report filed, my hands are tied. She swallowed. Thank you. That night, she bolted the doors and pulled the shades. Greypatch sensed the shift. He paced more than usual, his ears twitching at every creak in the walls. Milo was jumpy too. Nora sat in her chair, sketchbook untouched, staring into the fire. The air had changed. And the next morning confirmed it. A white truck with the Colorado Wildlife and Parks emblem pulled up the drive. Nora barely had time to move Greypatch to the back room before a knock shook the door. She opened it to a tall woman in a government-issue parka. Her ID badge read, Ranger Eliza Connors. Ma'am, she said politely. We've received a few reports about a wounded bobcat sighted near this ridge. May we ask if you've seen any unusual animal behavior on your property? Nora shook her head. Just deer in the mornings. One bear print last fall. That's it. The ranger nodded, but her eyes swept over the cabin's interior. Mind if we take a look around? Yes, I do, Nora said firmly. This is private property. Understood. If the animal becomes a danger to you or any surrounding pets, please contact our office. Wild animals can behave unpredictably, especially when injured. She handed Nora a pamphlet and left. Greypatch didn't come out for hours after that. Neither did Nora. The wind had changed direction. It now blew west to east, dry, fast, and unpredictable. The fire ban warning on the radio grew louder, more insistent. No open flames. No debris burning. Even the brush near the roads had been cleared. She knew what that meant. Fires were coming. And Greypatch was healing fast. That night, Nora opened the back door and stood beneath the stars. The mountains were a dark silhouette, jagged and unmoving. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote howled. Inside, Greypatch watched her from the shadows, his amber eyes reflecting the porch light. I won't stop you when you're ready, she whispered. He blinked once. Then twice. But he didn't move. He just stayed. And for now, that was enough. The smoke in the pines. The fire warnings came true. By the first week of February, the dry winds intensified, curling down the mountain slopes like invisible whips. Static filled the radio. Then came the voice of the local ranger dispatcher, clipped and urgent. Wildland fire reported northeast of Black Creek. All residents within Crescent Butte perimeter, prepare for immediate evacuation. Do not wait for a second warning. Nora set the radio down slowly, her hand trembling slightly. The sky outside had changed, no longer silver and clean, but dusted with an eerie ochre hue. The scent of pine and frost had vanished, replaced by the acrid sting of distant smoke. The air was too still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Inside, Greypatch had risen to his feet. He sniffed the air once, then twice. His muscles coiled like tight springs. For the first time in days, he didn't limp. He didn't pace. He moved with clarity, as if something ancient had stirred in his blood. You smell it too, Nora murmured, watching him from the doorframe. She reached for her go-bag, always packed, always ready. Flashlight. Thermal blankets. Milo's carrier. Water jugs in the truck. The plan was simple: drive north, away from the timberline, toward safe ground. Greypatch stood near the open doorway, staring out across the valley. His fur rippled in the wind. His ears twitched, picking up things she couldn't hear, movement in the brush, the roll of heat over earth, maybe even the trees whispering their slow panic. And then he turned. Their eyes met. Nora opened the door wider. "You don't have to go," she whispered. "You're safe here." But Greypatch didn't stay. He stepped onto the porch, glanced once more at her, then bounded off the edge and into the tree line with a grace that was heartbreakingly whole. She didn't chase him. She didn't cry. She simply stood in the doorway, hands gripping the frame, as his gray shadow vanished into the thinning woods. The fire wasn't visible yet. But something in Nora's chest had already begun to burn. And this time, it wasn't loss. It was love, wild, impossible, and true, running free toward whatever fate waited beyond the trees. The smoke rolled in faster than expected. By nightfall, the wind had turned savage. Ash fell like gray snow across the clearing, and the faint orange glow on the horizon confirmed what Nora already knew: the fire had jumped the ridge. She packed quickly but precisely. Milo meowed nervously from his carrier as she loaded it into the truck. The air was thick now, hard to breathe. Every instinct screamed to leave. But Nora hesitated at the cabin door, one last glance cast across the room that had become a home again. The fireplace was cold, but the memory of Greypatch curled in front of it felt fresh as morning dew. She stood at the threshold, keys in hand, when she heard it. A soft thud. Not from the roof. Not from the wind. From the porch. Nora froze. Slowly, she opened the door. Greypatch was back. But he wasn't alone. In his jaws, delicately held, was a tiny motionless fawn, barely a few weeks old, its legs tucked awkwardly beneath its body, a blackened patch of singed fur near its hindquarters. Greypatch's sides heaved, his chest rising and falling in sharp gasps. His eyes locked on Nora's, wild, urgent, pleading. Then, without a sound, he placed the fawn on the doormat and collapsed beside it. Nora's heart twisted. She dropped to her knees, her hands already reaching for both animals. The fawn was breathing, but just barely. Its eyes fluttered weakly, soot clinging to its lashes. Greypatch, though, was worse. His flank was scorched, his front paw bent unnaturally, and blood matted the fur beneath his ribs. "You came back," she whispered, her throat catching. He didn't move, but his tail gave one slow tap against the wood. She acted on instinct. Blankets. Water. She carried the fawn inside first, laying it gently on a towel near the fireplace. Then she returned for Greypatch, lifting his heavy, broken body into her arms one final time. He didn't resist. She nestled him beside the fawn, his breath rasping, shallow and slow. Milo crept from his carrier, sniffed the air, and sat silently nearby, as if understanding that this moment belonged to something greater than any one life. Nora stayed with them all night, her hand resting gently on Greypatch's side. Outside, the fire crept closer. But inside, the wild had come home. And in its final breath, it had delivered a miracle. When the fire goes out. Greypatch passed before sunrise. Nora had felt it before she confirmed it, that stillness too complete, that silence too final. One moment his chest rose in a shallow rhythm beneath her hand, the next, nothing. No twitch of his ear. No flicker of his tail. Just calm. Just peace. She didn't cry right away. Instead, she stroked the curve of his back gently, as if memorizing the pattern of his fur one last time. Milo stayed near, unusually quiet, as though he too understood the magnitude of the moment. The fawn stirred weakly beside Greypatch, nuzzling its nose into the crook of his leg. Nora couldn't explain it, but the gesture felt like a goodbye. The sun rose in streaks of gold through smoke-stained clouds. The mountains, usually so grand and distant, felt suddenly small, as though the cabin now held more weight than all the peaks surrounding it. Nora wrapped Greypatch in the same flannel jacket she had once used to warm him that first night. The fabric still carried the scent of the fireplace, of old cedar and melted snow. She carried him out behind the cabin, her boots crunching through frost and ash. There, under the lone pine her husband had planted decades ago, she dug. Her hands blistered, her knees sank into the thawing earth, but she didn't stop. Not until the hole was deep enough, not until the ground felt like it could cradle a life that had carried so much weight in silence. She laid him down gently. No words. Just a hand pressed to her heart, and a breath that quivered before it escaped. The pine tree above him swayed, not in grief, but in recognition. Nora covered the grave with care, each shovel of earth sealing away pain, but also something else: gratitude. For the quiet companionship. For the healing. For the choice he made to return, even when the wild called louder than comfort. She placed a smooth river stone at the head of the grave, carved nothing into it. Graypatch had never needed a name. Back inside, the fawn slept, wrapped in wool, its sides rising steadily now. It would live. She would make sure of it. And in that promise, a new rhythm began, different, quieter, but not empty. Graypatch had left something behind. Not just a memory, but the shape of connection. And Nora, for the first time in years, didn't feel alone. Spring arrived slowly in Crescent Butte, like a cautious guest testing each step on a creaky porch. The snow receded in patches, revealing stubborn tufts of green that hadn't given up. The air changed too, softer, cleaner. But for Nora Bellamy, the world was no longer just about weather and wood stoves. The cabin had changed. Or maybe she had. The fawn, now nicknamed Sprig, grew stronger with each passing week. Its burns healed, fur regrew, and curiosity bloomed like the alpine flowers returning to the hills. Nora fed it by hand at first, then taught it to nibble greens from the yard. Eventually, it began wandering toward the tree line, testing its legs, always returning before dusk. The day it didn't come back right away, Nora waited on the porch long after the sun dipped behind the ridge. But around midnight, there was a familiar shuffle in the brush. Sprig stood at the edge of the clearing, staring. Then it turned and bounded into the forest. Nora smiled. She knew. It would come back again. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not next week. But it would return. Just like Graypatch had. That summer, she opened the windows wide for the first time in years. She painted again, not just sketches in journals, but full canvases, wild, vivid landscapes with golden fawns and watchful bobcats hidden in shadows. Her hands, once stiff and slow, moved with purpose. She even started posting her work online. A small audience grew, people drawn to the quiet magic of her wilderness art. One day, a message came from a children's publisher in Denver. Your sketches tell stories. Would you ever consider turning one into a book? She stared at the email for a long time. Then she typed back, I already have one in mind. By autumn, The Wild Beside the Fire was published. 32 pages of watercolors and pencil, chronicling the quiet bond between a woman and a wild creature that taught her how to feel again. It was simple, honest. And it ended not with a grand farewell, but a single image. A woman, standing at the edge of the woods, watching a faint shadow disappear into the trees. She dedicated it simply to G. Paul came by one afternoon with coffee and dog-eared copies of the local fire reports. They sat on the porch, watching the trees sway. You know, he said, I didn't think he'd come back. Nora didn't look away from the forest. I didn't think I'd let him go. They sat in silence for a while after that, both listening for something they couldn't name. And then, just before the sun dipped behind the ridge, Nora saw it, a flicker of gray between the pines. Not a ghost. Not a memory. Just a shape. Still watching. Still part of her story. Always.